May 13, 1943. North Atlantic Ocean, approximately 400 miles southwest of Iceland. The consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, designated B-86, banked through heavy cloud cover at 8,000 feet, its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines thrumming against the wind. Inside the cramped fuselage, the crew of Royal Air Force Coastal Command scanned the grey Atlantic below, searching for the telltale wake or silhouette of a German U-boat. They had been airborne for 6 hours. Fuel reserves were calculated to the minute. The patrol sector, a rectangle of empty ocean, roughly 60 miles long, had yielded nothing but whitecaps, and the occasional merchant convoy steaming eastward toward Britain. Then, at 11:23 hours, the radio operator received an urgent transmission. A U-boat had been spotted on the surface, coordinates transmitted. The Liberator altered course. 28 minutes later, they found her. U-456, a Type 7IC submarine, caught on the surface while recharging batteries. The lookouts on the conning tower spotted the aircraft simultaneously. Alarm klaxons shrieked through the submarine's hull. Men scrambled. The U-boat's commander, Captain Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert, made the only decision available to him. Dive deep, survive until the aircraft exhausted its fuel and departed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Liberator circled once, marking the swirl of disturbed water where the submarine had submerged. The bomb bay doors opened. What fell from the aircraft was not a standard depth charge. It was 19 inches in diameter, 7 feet long, and weighed 680 pounds. It had no fins, no visible propulsion system. To any observer, it appeared to be exactly what its designation claimed. A mine, the Mark 24 mine, but it was not a mine. It splashed into the Atlantic at 11:57 hours. Upon water entry, it activated. A bellows and pendulum system guided it to a predetermined depth of 150 feet. There, it began to circle, searching. 4 piezoelectric hydrophones arranged symmetrically around its midsection listened to the ocean. They were tuned to 24 kHz, a specific frequency range. They were listening for a sound that every submarine made, a sound that could not be silenced, could not be stopped, could not be hidden no matter how deep the U-boat dove. They were listening for cavitation. At 12:03 hours, U-456 was 300 feet below the surface, running silent. All non-essential systems shut down. Crew members ordered to remain motionless. Teichert believed they were safe. He believed that depth meant survival. He believed the aircraft would drop its depth charges, circle for a time, then depart when its fuel ran low. He believed in the protective darkness of the deep Atlantic. He was wrong. The Mark 24 mine detected the acoustic signature at 12:04 hours. The hydrophones registered the sound, the vacuum tube signal processing system confirmed the target, and the proportional steering mechanism activated. The torpedo, for that is what it truly was, turned toward the source of the noise. Its electric motor, a standard General Electric washing machine motor modified for underwater use, drove a single propeller at 12 knots. It was slow, but it was patient, and it was listening to something the U-boat could not silence. To understand what happened in those final minutes of U-456's existence, we must first understand the war that had been raging across the Atlantic for nearly 4 years. By May of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a critical turning point. This was not a battle fought on a single day or in a single location. It was a continuous, grinding campaign of attrition that stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean, from the coast of North America to the approaches of Britain and the Soviet Union. The German U-boat arm, the Kriegsmarines Unterseebootwaffe, had come terrifyingly close to severing the lifeline between the New World and the Old. In March of 1943, German submarines sank 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic, totaling 476,000 tons of shipping. Oil tankers, cargo vessels, troop transports all sent to the bottom with their cargoes of food, fuel, weapons, and men. The official Royal Navy historian would later write that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between America and Britain as they did in the first 20 days of March 1943. The mathematics of the campaign were brutally simple. Germany needed to sink Allied ships faster than they could be built. The Allies needed to sink U-boats faster than German shipyards could replace them. For most of the war, Germany had been winning this equation. In 1942, at the peak of operations, U-boats were sinking an average of 96 Allied ships per month. German shipyards were producing 20 U-boats per month. Allied losses in most months amounted to less than half the German submarine force at sea. But by May 1943, something had changed. The U-boat strength reached its absolute peak that month. 240 operational submarines, 118 of them at sea simultaneously, prowling the convoy routes. It was the largest concentration of submarine power ever assembled. And yet, that same month, Allied shipping losses dropped dramatically. Only 34 ships totaling 134,000 tons were sunk in the Atlantic. At the same time, 43 German U-boats were destroyed, 43 submarines lost in a single month. 25% of Germany's operational submarine force, gone. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, was shocked. On May 24, 1943, he issued an order that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier. He withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs that had terrorized convoy routes for years simply vanished from the hunting grounds. The order was temporary, meant to allow regrouping and re-evaluation, but in practical terms, it marked the end of Germany's ability to threaten Allied supply lines. They would try again in the autumn, with new tactics and new technology, but they would never regain the initiative they had lost in May 1943. What had changed? What sudden reversal of fortune could account for such a dramatic shift in the balance of the Atlantic War? The answers were multiple. Better trained escort groups, improved tactics like the creeping attack pioneered by Commander Johnny Walker, closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap with very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, enhanced radar systems that could detect surfaced submarines at night, forward-throwing weapons like the Hedgehog mortar that allowed surface ships to maintain sonar contact while attacking. All of these factors contributed to what historians would call Black May, but there was another weapon, one so secret that even Allied reports referred to it only as the Mark 24 mine, a weapon that had entered service just days before U-456's final patrol, a weapon that represented a fundamental revolution in anti-submarine warfare. The German U-boat tactics of World War II were built upon a foundation of carefully tested doctrine and hard-won experience. Every U-boat commander graduating from the Kriegsmarine's submarine training program learned the same fundamental principles of survival. Attack at night when possible, preferably on the surface where the U-boat's diesel engines provided speed advantage over many convoy escorts. Fire torpedoes from maximum effective range. Once detected, dive immediately and go deep. Depth was survival. This was not theory. This was proven fact, validated by thousands of hours of operational experience. A U-boat's pressure hull was engineered to withstand the crushing force of water at depths far beyond what Allied depth charges could reach. The standard Type Sevi IC U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, had an official maximum operating depth of 220 meters, approximately 720 feet. In practice, skilled commanders regularly took their boats deeper when circumstances demanded. Some boats survived dives to 300 meters or more. The Allied depth charge, by contrast, had severe limitations. The standard British and American depth charges used throughout most of the war could be set to detonate at specific depths, but their maximum setting was typically around 500 feet. More importantly, the explosive force of a depth charge decreased rapidly with distance. A depth charge needed to detonate within approximately 15 feet of a submarine's hull to rupture the pressure hull and cause fatal damage. At 50 feet distance, the same explosion might cause minor damage, cracked gauges, broken light bulbs, rattled nerves, but nothing that would sink the boat. This created the fundamental tactical situation that defined anti-submarine warfare until 1943. When a U-boat detected an attacking surface ship through hydrophone listening, through visual sighting, or through the distinctive ping of Allied sonar, the commander ordered an emergency dive. The submarine would descend as rapidly as possible, often at steep angles that sent loose equipment and crew members tumbling forward. Once below 200 feet, the commander would order silent running, all non-essential machinery shut down, electric motors reduced to minimum speed. Crew members ordered to remain absolutely still, speaking only in whispers if they had to speak at all. Then came the waiting. The surface ships would circle overhead, their sonar transmitters pinging, trying to maintain contact with the submerged target. When they believed they had a firm contact, they would increase speed and run directly over the estimated position of the submarine, rolling depth charges off stern racks or firing them from side-mounted throwers called K-guns. The charges would sink through the water column, their hydrostatic triggers set to detonate at the depth where the escorts believed the U-boat to be hiding. For the men inside the submarine, the experience was one of primal terror mixed with calculated hope. They could hear the propellers of the attacking ships through the hull, the thrashing sound growing louder as the escort approached, then fading as it passed overhead. They counted seconds. When the depth charges detonated, the explosions hammered through the water like the fists of an angry god. The submarine's hull rang like a bell. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Sometimes pipes burst, flooding compartments with seawater or high-pressure air. Sometimes electrical systems short-circuited, filling spaces with acrid smoke and the threat of fire. But if the U-boat was deep enough, and if the depth charges were set even slightly wrong, the boat survived. The commander would order emergency repairs. Compressed air would blow water from damaged ballast tanks. The electric motors would drive the boat away from the attack site, moving slowly, quietly, conserving the batteries that were the submarine's only source of power while submerged. And eventually, after hours of cat-and-mouse pursuit, the surface ships would lose contact or exhaust their depth charges or be called away to rejoin their convoy. The U-boat would survive to fight again. This was the doctrine. This was the reality that had been proven in hundreds of engagements across 3 years of war. Dive deep, run silent, wait for the escorts to exhaust themselves. Depth equaled survival. The deeper you went, the safer you were. Until May 1943, this doctrine had never been fundamentally challenged. The weapon that fell from the Liberator on May 13, 1943, had been conceived in a meeting room at Harvard University on December 10, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. The United States was not yet prepared for war, but certain men in certain positions understood that preparation could not wait for readiness. The National Defense Research Committee convened a meeting at Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory to discuss a question that had plagued naval warfare since the First World War. Could a torpedo be designed to find its own target? The concept was theoretically simple. Sound travels efficiently through water. A submarine in motion creates noise, propeller noise, machinery noise, hull noise from water flowing across steel plates. If a torpedo could be equipped with underwater microphones and a guidance system capable of steering toward the loudest noise, it could theoretically hunt a submarine the way a dog hunts by scent. The problem was that no one had successfully built such a weapon. The technology required did not yet exist in a practical form. The Office of Scientific Research and Development designated the project as Project 61. The code name was Fido, chosen to evoke the image of a faithful dog tracking its quarry with dogged determination. 2 institutions received parallel development contracts with complete information sharing between them: Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Laboratories. Western Electric was tasked with developing a lightweight, shock-resistant, 48-volt lead-acid battery capable of providing 110 amperes for 15 minutes. General Electric was assigned to design propulsion and steering motors. The David Taylor model basin would handle hydrodynamics and hull design. The requirements were specific and demanding. The weapon had to fit into a standard 1,000-pound bomb rack on aircraft ranging from patrol bombers to carrier-based attack planes. This meant maximum dimensions of 19 inches diameter by 90 inches length. It had to survive an airdrop from altitudes up to 300 feet at aircraft speeds up to 120 knots. It had to function in water temperatures ranging from near freezing in the North Atlantic to tropical warmth in the Pacific. And most critically, it had to detect and home on submarine noise at ranges sufficient to guarantee a kill before the target could maneuver away. The guidance system presented the greatest technical challenge. 4 piezoelectric hydrophones were mounted symmetrically around the torpedo's midsection, connected to a vacuum tube-based signal processing array housed in the nose section. The hydrophones operated at 24 kHz, well above the range of most natural ocean sounds, but within the frequency range where submarine propeller cavitation produced strong acoustic signals. The processing system compared the amplitude of signals received by each hydrophone. When one hydrophone received a stronger signal than the others, the system knew the target was in that direction. 2 different steering approaches were developed and tested in parallel. Harvard's system used non-proportional steering when the target was detected to port. The rudders went hard left. When detected to starboard, hard right. The torpedo would zigzag toward the target like a hunting dog following a scent trail. Bell Laboratories developed proportional steering, where rudder deflection was proportional to the difference in signal strength between hydrophones. The stronger the signal from one side, the harder the turn. After extensive testing, Bell's proportional system was selected for production because it produced a smoother, more efficient approach to the target. The warhead was 92 pounds of HBX high, explosive, sufficient to rupture a submarine's pressure hull on contact. The propulsion system was deliberately simple. A General Electric motor, essentially an off-the-shelf washing machine motor, adapted for underwater use, driving a single propeller. The motor produced 7.5 horsepower, pushing the torpedo to a maximum speed of 12 knots, with an endurance of approximately 10 minutes. This gave an effective range of roughly 4,000 yards. 12 knots seems impossibly slow for a weapon system. Most anti-ship torpedoes of the era travelled at 30 to 45 knots. But the Mark 24 was not designed to chase surface ships. It was designed to hunt submerged submarines, and submerged submarines were slow. A Type CEV-IC U-boat could make approximately 18 knots on the surface using its diesel engines, but underwater, running on battery power, maximum speed was only 7.5 knots. And that maximum speed could only be sustained for brief periods before the batteries exhausted themselves. At economical underwater speed, preserving battery reserves, a U-boat travelled at 4 to 5 knots. 12 knots was more than fast enough. The torpedo had a 4 to 7 knot speed advantage over any submerged target. Once it acquired the acoustic signature, the submarine could not outrun it. The only question was whether the acoustic homing system would work as designed. By June 1942, even though major testing remained incomplete, the Navy made the decision to begin production. The urgency of the Atlantic War overrode the normal caution of weapons development. The initial production order was for 10,000 torpedoes. Western Electric Company received the manufacturing contract. Each unit cost $1,800, expensive for the era, but trivial compared to the cost of a submarine or the value of the merchant ships that submarines were sinking. Testing continued through the autumn and winter of 1942. Prototype torpedoes were dropped from aircraft at the Navy's test facilities in Key West, Florida. They performed well in controlled conditions, but controlled conditions were not combat. No one knew how the Mark 24 would perform against an actual submarine, maneuvering evasively at warfighting depths in the North Atlantic's harsh environment. The first production models were delivered to operational squadrons in March 1943. Crews received minimal training. The weapon's true nature was classified at the highest level. Pilots were told only that this was a new type of mine that should be dropped near a diving submarine. The first combat use occurred on May 12, 1943. A Royal Air Force Liberator defending convoy HX-237 detected U-456 on the surface and attacked. The U-boat dove. The Liberator dropped a Mark 24. The torpedo entered the water, began its circular search pattern, detected the submarine's acoustic signature, and homed to contact. U-456 was damaged but managed to survive the initial attack. The submarine limped toward port, severely wounded. The following day, May 13th, the same U-boat was located again. This time there would be no survival. Inside U-456, 300 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, Captain Lieutenant Teichert and his crew of 47 men waited in the darkness. The submarine had been submerged for 17 minutes. Silent running procedures were in effect throughout the boat. In the control room, the diving officer monitored the depth gauge and trim indicators with obsessive attention. The slightest deviation had to be corrected immediately but silently, using minimal ballast adjustments and minimal motor power. In the forward torpedo room, men sat motionless on their bunks, breathing shallowly, trying not to make the slightest sound that might be detected by the enemy above. They had done this before. Teichert had commanded U-456 through 7 combat patrols. His crew knew the drill. You dove deep, you ran silent, you waited, the aircraft would circle for a time, perhaps drop a few depth charges blindly into the area where they thought you might be, then depart when fuel ran low. Aircraft could not stay on station indefinitely. You just had to wait them out. The hydrophone operator sat at his station, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to the sounds of the ocean. He could hear the distant thrash of the Liberator's engines through the water, a rhythmic pulsing that grew louder and softer as the aircraft circled above. He reported bearing and relative intensity to the control room in whispers. Teichert used this information to plot the aircraft's search pattern, watching for any indication that they might depart. Then, at 12:04 hours, the hydrophone operator heard something different. A new sound, mechanical, regular, moving. He reported it immediately. Teichert asked for a bearing. The operator gave coordinates. Whatever was making the sound was not on the surface. It was at depth, and it was getting closer. This was not unprecedented. Sometimes surface ships would try to creep up on a submerged U-boat, moving slowly with engines at minimum power, hoping to get close enough for an accurate depth charge attack. But this sound was different, too regular, too mechanical, and it seemed to be changing direction following them. Teichert made a decision based on the doctrine that had saved his life before. He ordered a course change, hard to starboard. The electric motors engaged, driving the submarine into a tight turn. The maneuver would drain battery power, but it should shake whatever was following them. In submarine warfare, the hunted vessel always had the advantage underwater. Surface ships were loud, easy to detect, easy to evade. You simply turned away from them and slipped into a different layer of water. The hydrophone operator continued tracking the sound. For perhaps 30 seconds, the bearing changed as expected. The sound was receding, then it steadied, then it began to close again. Whatever was out there had turned to follow them. The hydrophone operator reported this information, his voice tight with an emotion that submarine crews rarely expressed. Uncertainty. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Teichert ordered another course change, port this time. Then a descent to 350 feet, deeper than the official maximum operating depth, but well within the boat's tested limits. The hull groaned slightly as the water pressure increased. Men glanced at the overhead, at the riveted seams where steel plates joined, watching for the first signs of leakage that would indicate the pressure hull was beginning to fail. But the hull held. They were deep. They were safe. The sound continued to close, bearing steady, distance decreasing. Now the entire control room crew could hear it through the hull without hydrophones. A mechanical thrumming, regular, purposeful, hunting. What Teichert could not know, what no U-boat commander yet knew, was that the sound the hydrophone operator was tracking was not the sound of the weapon hunting him. It was the sound of his own submarine. Specifically, it was the sound of cavitation from U-456's propellers. Cavitation is a hydrodynamic phenomenon that occurs when a propeller blade moves through water faster than the water can flow around it. The pressure on the forward face of the blade drops so low that the water literally boils, forming vapor bubbles. These bubbles then collapse violently as they move to regions of higher pressure, creating shock waves that propagate through the water as sound. High-frequency sound, loud sound. sound that can be detected at considerable distances by a hydrophone tuned to the right frequency range. Every propeller-driven vessel creates cavitation to some degree. Surface ships cavitate extensively, which is why they are so easy to detect with passive sonar. Submarines, with their carefully designed propellers and relatively slow underwater speeds, generate less cavitation than surface ships. And at 24 kHz, the frequency at which the Mark 24's hydrophones operated, propeller cavitation produced a strong, distinctive acoustic signature that could be detected at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The deeper U-456 dove, the harder her propellers had to work to maintain steerage way against the increasing water density. The harder the propellers worked, the more cavitation they generated. The more cavitation they generated, the louder the acoustic signature became. Teichert's attempt to escape by diving deeper was actually making his submarine easier for the Mark 24 to track. At 12:07 hours, the crew of U-456 heard a different sound, a metallic scraping along the hull. Something had struck the submarine's outer casing and was sliding along the steel plates. For a brief moment, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, there was confusion about what this meant. Then the Mark 24's contact fuse triggered. 92 pounds of HBX high explosive detonated against the pressure hull, just aft of the control room. The explosion ruptured the pressure hull in multiple locations. Water under 350 feet of pressure, approximately 155 pounds per square inch, blasted through the breaches with the force of a fire hose. The after compartments flooded instantly. Men in those spaces died within seconds, either from the concussive force of the explosion or from drowning in the sudden deluge of seawater that filled every available volume faster than human lungs could draw breath. In the control room, the damage was less, immediately catastrophic but no less fatal. The submarine's electrical systems short-circuited as seawater reached battery compartments. The lights failed, plunging the boat into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on, weak red bulbs that illuminated a scene of controlled chaos. The diving officer reported that depth control was lost. The submarine was settling by the stern, nose angling upward at an increasingly steep angle. Without power to the pumps, without the ability to blow ballast tanks, there was no way to stop the descent. Teichert understood immediately that his boat was dying. The question was whether his crew could escape. He ordered all hands to the forward compartments and began emergency surfacing procedures. Compressed air reserves were released into the forward ballast tanks. For a moment, it seemed to work. The descent slowed, the bow began to rise, but there was too much water in the after compartments, too much weight pulling the stern down. At 12:11 hours, U-456 struck the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of approximately 480 feet. The impact collapsed the already weakened hull structure. The few men still alive in the forward torpedo room attempted to use the escape equipment individual breathing apparatus and escape hatches designed to allow evacuation from a sunken submarine. But 480 feet was far beyond the tested limits of the escape system. The water pressure at that depth would crush human lungs before a man could reach the surface, and even if the pressure could somehow be survived, the rapid ascent would cause decompression sickness that would kill within minutes. No one escaped from U-456. All 48 men aboard died. The submarine remained on the bottom of the Atlantic, her hull gradually deteriorating, until she was located by sonar survey in the 1980s and positively identified through archival research. She remains there still, a war, grave protected under international maritime law. The destruction of U-456 was reported to Royal Air Force Coastal Command as a probable kill. The Liberator crew could not be certain the submarine had been destroyed. They had not witnessed debris or bodies rising to the surface. But the underwater explosion had been clearly audible, and no oil slick or surfacing had been observed after the attack. The report was filed, the aircraft returned to base, and the crew received credit for a successful engagement. What they did not know, what no one in Allied anti-submarine forces yet fully understood, was that they had just demonstrated a fundamental revolution in naval warfare. For the first time in history, a submarine diving to escape destruction had been tracked and killed not by visual sighting, not by active sonar, but by the sound of its own propellers. The protective doctrine of depth, the carefully cultivated belief that diving deep meant diving to safety, had been rendered obsolete by a weapon that listened for the one sound a moving submarine could never silence. U-456 was not the first U-boat sunk by a Mark 24. That distinction belongs to either U-657 or U-640, both sunk on May 14 by United States Navy patrol aircraft. Historical records are unclear about which submarine was engaged first, but U-456's destruction on May 13 was among the earliest combat successes of the Acoustic Torpedo, and it established the pattern that would be repeated 36 more times before the end of the war. The Mark 24 sank 37 Axis submarines in total, 31 German and 6 Japanese. An additional 18 submarines, 15 German and 3 Japanese, were damaged by FIDO attacks, but managed to survive and return to port. Out of 204 Mark 24 torpedoes fired in combat, this represented a success rate of approximately 18%. By comparison, conventional aircraft dropped depth charges achieved a success rate of only 9.5%. The acoustic torpedo was twice as effective as the weapons it replaced, but these raw statistics, impressive as they are, do not capture the psychological impact of the weapon. For German U-boat crews, the appearance of the acoustic torpedo represented a fundamental shattering of their understanding of submarine warfare. The doctrine they had been taught, the tactics they had practiced, the beliefs that had kept them alive through previous patrols, all of it became suspect. If diving deep no longer guaranteed safety, what did? If the sound of your own propellers was being used to guide weapons to your hull, how could you evade? Some U-boats responded by attempting to run completely silent when under attack, shutting down all propulsion and drifting motionless at depth. This tactic could work, but only if the submarine had not already been detected. Once a Mark 24 acquired the acoustic signature, going silent would only cause the torpedo to resume its circular search pattern. It would continue listening, circling, waiting. Eventually, the submarine would have to move to correct depth to avoid hitting the bottom, to prevent the crew from suffocating as carbon dioxide levels rose. And the moment the propellers engaged, the torpedo would detect it and resume the attack. Other U-boats attempted radical depth changes, plunging to maximum depth or rising toward the surface, hoping to break the acoustic lock. This rarely worked. The Mark 24's guidance system could track depth changes as long as the target remained within detection range, and rapid depth changes required increased propeller speed, which only made the cavitation signature louder and easier to track. The most successful evasion tactic, developed through bitter experience, was to surface immediately upon detecting an acoustic torpedo. On the surface, the U-boat's diesel engines gave it speed advantage over the 12-knot torpedo. The Mark 24's programming included a safety feature that caused it to resume circular searching if it rose above 40 feet depth, specifically to prevent it from attacking surface ships. A U-boat that surfaced quickly enough could theoretically escape, but surfacing meant exposing the submarine to aircraft attack. Cannon fire, bombs, rockets, all the weapons that aircraft carried were devastating against a surfaced submarine. It was a choice between certain death underwater and probable death on the surface. Most commanders chose the surface. Some survived, most did not. The Mark 24 mine remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. Even after the war ended, the weapon's existence and capabilities were not publicly disclosed for years. Wartime photographs of the torpedo are remarkably scarce. Official reports referred to it only as a mine, never as an acoustic homing torpedo. When U-boat survivors were interrogated after being rescued, Allied intelligence officers carefully avoided any questions that might reveal what had actually sunk their submarines. The goal was to prevent Germany from understanding the nature of the weapon and developing effective countermeasures. This secrecy served a strategic purpose beyond simple security. As long as U-boat commanders did not understand what was hunting them, they could not develop reliable evasion tactics. They knew something new was killing submarines, something different from conventional depth charges. But without understanding the acoustic homing mechanism, they could not know that their own propeller noise was betraying them. This uncertainty amplified the psychological impact of every attack. When a U-boat dove to escape an aircraft and then heard a mechanical sound approaching through the water, the crew knew they might be about to die, but they did not know why or how to prevent it. German naval intelligence attempted to piece together information from survivors and from analysis of Allied tactics. By late 1943, they had concluded that the Allies possessed some form of acoustic homing weapon. Germany's own acoustic torpedo program had produced the G7S Zaunkönig, known to the Allies as the Gnat, which entered service in August 1943. This torpedo homed on the propeller noise of surface ships, using similar acoustic principles to the Mark 24. The Germans understood the physics. They could infer that the Allies had developed comparable technology, but understanding that such a weapon existed was different from knowing its specific capabilities and limitations. German U-boats were equipped with a decoy device called Bold, a canister that released chemicals, which created a large bubble cloud in the water, theoretically providing a false acoustic target. Bold had limited effectiveness against the Mark 24 because the bubble clouds did not produce the same frequency signature as propeller cavitation. Some U-boats also experimented with coating their propeller blades with rubber compounds designed to reduce cavitation, but this required extensive dockyard work and reduced the propeller's efficiency. The most effective German countermeasure was not technological but tactical: avoid being detected by aircraft in the first place. U-boats began traveling submerged whenever possible in areas where Allied air patrols were heavy. They installed schnorkel systems that allowed diesel engines to run while the submarine remained submerged at periscope depth, reducing the need to surface in dangerous waters. These adaptations helped reduce losses, but they also reduced operational effectiveness. A U-boat traveling submerged could not scout effectively, could not reach attack positions quickly, could not intercept convoys over long distances. By the end of 1943, the production order for Mark 24 torpedoes had been reduced from the original 10,000 units to 4,000. This was not because the weapon had failed. It was because the weapon had succeeded beyond expectations. The effectiveness rate was so high that fewer torpedoes were needed to achieve the desired operational impact. Each torpedo cost $1,800 to manufacture, expensive by wartime standards, but a bargain compared to the cost of the submarines it destroyed. A Type 7IC U-boat represented an investment of approximately 4.5 million Reichsmarks, plus the trained crew of 48 men whose education and experience could not be quickly replaced. The Mark 24 remained in service with the United States Navy until 1948. By that time, new torpedo designs with improved guidance systems and greater range were entering production, but the principles established by Project Fido, passive acoustic homing, autonomous target tracking, fire and forget engagement, became the foundation for all subsequent acoustic torpedo development. Modern torpedoes used by navies worldwide still employ descendants of the technology first tested in the North Atlantic in May 1943. The weapon's impact extended beyond its direct combat effectiveness. The Mark 24 fundamentally changed how submarines operated in wartime. The assumption that depth provided safety was permanently shattered. Post-war submarine design emphasized silent running, reducing machinery noise, isolating vibration sources, designing propellers that minimized cavitation even at high speeds. The nuclear submarines developed in the 1950s were not just faster and longer ranged than their diesel-electric predecessors. They were quieter, because in the post-Fido world, silence meant survival. The men who developed the Mark 24 received little public recognition during or immediately after the war. The project was classified. The scientists and engineers at Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Laboratories returned to their peacetime research without fanfare. Some continued working on underwater acoustics for the Navy's post-war submarine programs. Others moved into different fields entirely. But their work had demonstrated something that would shape military technology development for the next 80 years. Autonomous weapons guided by sensor systems could be more effective than weapons requiring continuous human guidance. This was not artificial intelligence in the modern sense. The Mark 24's vacuum tube-based processing system could not learn or adapt. It simply followed fixed rules. Detect the loudest sound at 24 kHz, steer toward it, detonate on contact. But within those simple rules lay a revolutionary principle. A weapon could hunt without a human operator making continuous decisions. It could be launched and then operate independently until it either found its target or exhausted its fuel. To understand the true significance of the Mark 24 mine, we must return to the statistics of May 1943 and examine them not merely as numbers, but as the concrete reality they represented. 43 German U-boats lost in a single month. This was not simply a bad month or an unlucky series of engagements. It was a fundamental inflection point in the mathematics of attrition warfare. German shipyards were producing approximately 20 U-boats per month through most of 1943. To sustain operations, losses had to remain below that production rate. In the months before May, this equation had generally held. Losses were serious but manageable. Experienced commanders were being killed, but new commanders were being trained. Submarines were being sunk, but new submarines were being launched. The U-boat arm was not winning the Atlantic War, but it was not losing either. May changed the calculation. 43 boats lost meant that for that single month, losses exceeded production by more than 2-1. Even if production could be increased, which was difficult given Germany's competing demands for steel, labour, and manufacturing capacity, losses on that scale could not be sustained. The numbers were simple and brutal. At that loss rate, the entire operational U-boat force would be destroyed in less than 6 months. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The other part is who was being lost. U-456's commander, Captain Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert, had completed 7 combat patrols. He was not an ace, his tonnage totals were modest compared to the most successful commanders, but he was experienced. He understood how to survive in the increasingly dangerous environment of the North Atlantic. When U-456 went down, the Kriegsmarine lost not just a submarine, but the accumulated experience of 7 patrols, the tactical knowledge that could only be gained through surviving actual combat. That knowledge died with Teichert and his crew at the bottom of the Atlantic. This pattern repeated across all 43 losses in May 1943. Some of the boats sunk were relatively new, on their first or second patrols, commanded by officers fresh from training. But many were experienced boats with experienced crews. U-567 was sunk on May 21st after 9 combat patrols. Her commander, Engelbert Endras, was one of the Kriegsmarine's most decorated officers, with over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping to his credit. His death represented not just the loss of a skilled officer, but the loss of tactical expertise that would have been passed to the next generation of commanders through the training program. The Mark 24 mine accounted for only a fraction of the May losses, perhaps 3 or 4 confirmed kills, with several more probables. Most U-boats in May were sunk by surface escorts using conventional depth charges and new weapons like the Hedgehog mortar, or by aircraft using improved radar and depth charges. But the Acoustic Torpedoes' psychological impact exceeded its direct combat effectiveness. U-boat crews who survived attacks and returned to port brought with them stories of a new weapon that could hunt them in the depths, that could track them no matter how deep they dove, that could follow their evasive maneuvers as if guided by an intelligent hunter. These stories spread through the U-boat bases. Men waiting to depart on their next patrol heard them. Some commanders requested additional training on acoustic countermeasures before sailing. Some crews requested transfers to different duties. The morale impact is difficult to quantify, but it was real. Submarine warfare had always been dangerous. Casualty rates among U-boat crews were higher than any other branch of the German military throughout the war, but there had always been the belief that skill and experience could improve survival odds. The acoustic torpedo challenged that belief. If your own propellers betrayed you, if diving deep only made you easier to track, what could skill accomplish? Admiral Dönitz's withdrawal order on May 24th was presented to his crews as a temporary measure, a tactical pause to allow re-equipping and retraining. But many U-boat commanders understood it for what it truly was, an acknowledgement of defeat. The Wolfpacks returned to the Atlantic in autumn 1943 with new equipment, new tactics, and new directives, but they never regained the initiative they had lost in May. From that point forward, U-boat operations were fundamentally defensive. The submarines continued to sink Allied ships throughout 1944 and into 1945, but they were no longer a strategic threat to Britain's survival. The Battle of the Atlantic had been decided. The Mark 24 mine's contribution to this outcome was proportionally small but strategically significant. Of the approximately 204 acoustic torpedoes fired in combat during the war, 37 achieved kills, 18% success rate. This represented less than 4% of all U-boats sunk by Allied forces during the war. But those 37 kills came at critical moments and in critical locations. They demonstrated that submarines could no longer rely on depth for protection. They forced changes in German tactics that reduced U-boat effectiveness, and they validated a new approach to anti-submarine warfare that would shape naval tactics for generations to come. The weapon also represented a different model of wartime research and development. Project Fido went from initial concept meeting in December 1941 to first combat success in May 1943, 17 months, from conception to deployment. This was extraordinarily fast by the standards of military weapons development. The speed was possible because the project was managed outside the normal Navy bureaucracy, under the direct oversight of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Scientists and engineers from universities and private industry worked together with unusual freedom to experiment, to fail, to redesign, and to test, without the delays typical of military procurement processes. The central irony of the Mark 24 mine is that it turned the U-boat's greatest defensive tactic into their greatest vulnerability. For 3 years, German submarine commanders had been trained that depth meant safety. When attacked on the surface, dive. When detected by sonar, go deeper. When depth charges exploded around you, descend below their maximum effective range and wait out the attack. This doctrine was not speculation. It was proven by experience. Hundreds of U-boats had survived attacks by diving deep. The tactic worked, until it didn't. The acoustic torpedo inverted this equation. The deeper a U-boat dove, the harder its propellers worked against the increasing water density. The harder the propellers worked, the more cavitation they generated. The more cavitation, the louder the acoustic signature at 24 kHz. A U-boat attempting to escape by diving deep was actually broadcasting its position more clearly to the weapon hunting it. The defensive maneuver became a beacon, drawing the torpedo toward its target with increasing precision. This represents a particular kind of technological revolution, not the introduction of an entirely new capability, but the subversion of existing doctrine through exploitation of an unavoidable physical principle. Propellers in water create cavitation. This is physics, not engineering choice. It can be minimized through careful design, but it cannot be eliminated while still generating thrust. Every moving submarine creates this acoustic signature. The Mark 24 simply listened for it and followed it to its source. The parallel to other technologies in World War II is striking. Radar allowed the detection of aircraft and ships that believed they were hidden by darkness or weather. Code breaking allowed the reading of messages that commanders believed were secure. Proximity fuses allowed artillery shells to detonate near targets they would otherwise have missed. In each case, the technology did not provide a new way to attack. It provided a new way to find and track targets that believed they were protected by distance, by concealment, by depth. The men who died aboard U-456 on May 13, 1943, died believing they had followed correct procedure. Teichert made the right tactical decisions based on the doctrine he had been taught. He dove when attacked. He went deep to escape depth charges. He maneuvered to evade pursuing vessels. He did everything he had been trained to do, everything that had worked before. It was not enough. The rules had changed, and he did not know it until the moment the Mark 24's warhead detonated against his submarine's hull. This is the nature of technological warfare. Doctrine becomes obsolete not through error but through innovation. The tactics that saved lives yesterday kill today. The protective measures that worked last month fail this month. Survival requires not just following established procedures, but recognizing when those procedures no longer apply. U-boat commanders in May 1943 could not know that their fundamental assumptions about submarine warfare had been invalidated. They learned only when the evidence was undeniable and fatal. The long-term impact of the Mark 24 extended far beyond World War II. Post-war submarine development was dominated by the quest for silence. Nuclear submarines were not just faster and longer-ranged than their diesel-electric predecessors. They were designed from the keel up to minimize acoustic signature. Machinery was mounted on sound-dampening isolators. Hull shapes were optimized to reduce flow noise. Propellers were designed to operate with minimal cavitation across their entire speed range. Crew members were trained in silent running procedures that would have seemed paranoid to World War II submarine commanders. This obsession with acoustic stealth was a direct legacy of the Mark 24. The weapon demonstrated that a submarine's own noise could kill it. Every subsequent submarine design had to account for this reality. The Cold War submarine forces of the United States and Soviet Union spent enormous resources on acoustic quieting technology, each side attempting to build submarines that could operate undetected while using increasingly sensitive sonar systems to detect the enemy. The technological competition was direct and measurable. If your submarines were louder than your enemy's sensors were sensitive, you lost. If your sensors were more sensitive than your enemy's submarines were quiet, you won. The Mark 24 mine itself became obsolete within a few years of the war's end. Improved acoustic, torpedoes with greater range, higher speed, and more sophisticated guidance systems replaced it. But the principle it embodied, passive acoustic homing on target-generated noise, became standard for all anti-submarine torpedoes developed afterward. Modern torpedoes, like the American Mark 48 and Mark 54, use vastly more sophisticated signal processing, can distinguish between different targets based on acoustic signature, and can pursue targets at much greater speeds and ranges. But they are still doing fundamentally what the Mark 24 did, listening for the sound of propellers and steering toward it. The story of the Mark 24 mine reminds us that innovation in warfare often comes not from overwhelming force, but from exploiting fundamental physics in new ways. The torpedo was not particularly powerful. 92 pounds of explosive could be devastating, but it was not dramatically more powerful than conventional depth charges. It was not particularly fast. 12 knots made it one of the slowest torpedoes ever deployed. It did not have sophisticated guidance vacuum tube circuits. Performing simple amplitude comparison could hardly be called advanced even by 1943 standards. But it listened. It listened for a sound that submarines could not avoid making. It followed that sound with mechanical patience, and it turned the submarine's defensive doctrine, dive deep, run silent, wait out the attack, into a fatal trap. The U-boats dove deep. The Mark 24 followed them down, and the protective darkness of the Atlantic depths became a killing ground from which there was no escape. 48 men died aboard U-456. They were not the first, and they would not be the last. But their deaths marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, one in which the ocean's depths no longer offered protection, one in which a submarine's own movement betrayed it to weapons that hunted by sound alone. The doctrine of depth, proven by 3 years of combat experience, had been shattered by a 7-foot-long cylinder with 4 hydrophones and a washing machine motor. The age of acoustic warfare had begun. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.